Midnight, March 11th, 1801. A group of drunk Russian officers forces its way into the bedroom of Mikhailovsky Castle in St. Petersburg. Their target is the Emperor of Russia, Paul I, who has ruled for 4 years with increasing paranoia and erratic cruelty. Paul wakes to find conspirators surrounding his bed. What follows is chaotic, brutal, and deeply undignified. The Tsar is strangled with a scarf, beaten, and finished off with a golden snuffbox smashed into his temple. By morning, his son Alexander is Emperor of Russia, and the official announcement claims Paul died of apoplexy. Nobody believes it. This is the story of Paul I, the Tsar who spent 42 years as his mother's prisoner, who ruled for 4 years with the manic energy of a man making up for lost time, who alienated every powerful group in Russia simultaneously, and who died at the hands of the very men whose loyalty he most desperately needed. Paul Petrovich was born in 1754, the son of the future Catherine the Great and her husband Peter III. From the very beginning, his life was shaped by forces beyond his control. His mother Catherine was ambitious, brilliant, and utterly ruthless. His father Peter III was erratic, possibly mentally unstable, and passionately pro-Prussian in a court that viewed Prussia as an enemy. Paul was born into a marriage that was already collapsing and a court that was already conspiring. Whether Paul was actually Peter III's biological son was a question whispered at court throughout his life. Catherine had lovers, several of them at the time of Paul's conception. Some historians believe Paul's father was Sergei Saltykov, one of Catherine's early favorites. Catherine herself, in her memoirs, was deliberately ambiguous on the subject. Paul would spend his entire life under this shadow, knowing that his legitimacy was questioned and that his mother, at minimum, allowed the questions to persist. Peter III was overthrown and killed in 1762 when Paul was 8 years old. The coup that brought Catherine to power as Empress of Russia made her son simultaneously the heir to the throne and a potential rival. Catherine's advisors had suggested making Paul emperor immediately, with Catherine as regent. But Catherine had no intention of being merely a regent. She would be empress in her own right. Paul was taken from his mother immediately after birth by Empress Elizabeth, Catherine's predecessor, who raised him according to her own ideas. When Catherine seized power, she effectively continued this separation, keeping Paul at a distance from court and from real power. Paul received excellent education and grew into an intelligent, well-read young man with genuine intellectual interests. But he had essentially no role in government, no real responsibilities, and no outlet for his considerable energy. The years passed, and Catherine showed no intention of allowing Paul to participate in governance. He received a military appointment, but no real command. He married twice, his first wife dying in childbirth, and his second wife, Maria Feodorovna, proving a capable partner who bore him numerous children. But personal happiness didn't compensate for political irrelevance. Paul watched from Gatchina, his estate outside St. Petersburg, as his mother governed Russia for decades without him. Gatchina became Paul's kingdom in miniature. He commanded his own small military force there, drilling them obsessively in Prussian-style military discipline that Catherine's regular army had long abandoned. He developed rigid ideas about military procedure, palace protocol, and proper order. He genuinely believed that Russia needed stricter discipline and clearer hierarchy. The court at St. Petersburg seemed to him chaotic, corrupt, and morally decadent. Gatchina was his laboratory for the orderly Russia he would create when his time came. The relationship between Paul and Catherine deteriorated over decades. Paul resented his exclusion from power and suspected, not without reason, that Catherine might disinherit him in favor of his son Alexander. Catherine, for her part, found Paul erratic, difficult, and worryingly sympathetic to ideas about limiting monarchical power. They had substantive disagreements about foreign policy, military organization, and governance. Visits between mother and son were stiff and uncomfortable. By the 1790s, Paul was in his 40s and had been waiting for power his entire life. He had watched Catherine transform Russia into a great European power while he drilled toy soldiers at Gatchina. He had seen his ideas about governance dismissed and ignored. He had observed the Russian nobility grow wealthy and powerful under Catherine's indulgent rule, with the nobility gaining rights and privileges that Paul believed undermined proper hierarchy and discipline. When Catherine died in November 1796, Paul finally had his chance to remake Russia. He had exactly 4 years and 4 months before his officers decided they'd had enough. Paul moved immediately and with breathtaking speed. Within hours of Catherine's death, he was issuing decrees, changing procedures, and signaling that everything was about to change. Courtiers who had spent decades under Catherine's rule were immediately confronted with a Tsar who had very different ideas about how Russia should be governed. The military reforms came first and hit hardest. Paul replaced Catherine's relatively relaxed military culture with the rigid Prussian-style discipline he had developed at Gatchina. Uniforms were changed to Prussian models, complete with powdered wigs and tight knee breeches that were both uncomfortable and impractical. Drill procedures were overhauled. Officers who had risen through Catherine's army faced demotion, reassignment, or dismissal if they couldn't adapt to Paul's exacting standards. Noble officers, used to a degree of comfortable independence, found themselves subjected to public humiliation. Paul would personally inspect troops and dismiss officers on the spot for uniform infractions, incorrect salutes, or marching irregularities. Officers who had commanded regiments for years were reduced to the ranks for minor violations. The humiliation was deliberate. Paul believed that pride had made the Russian officer corps arrogant and undisciplined, and he intended to break that pride. The nobles received equally shocking treatment. Under Catherine, the Russian nobility had enjoyed substantial privileges, freedom from compulsory state service, rights to petition the crown, protection from corporal punishment. Paul attacked these privileges systematically. He reinstated compulsory service requirements. He introduced corporal punishment for nobles, treating them like common criminals when they transgressed. He dismissed and exiled nobles who displeased him without explanation or process. Paul's manner of rule was deeply personal and intensely confrontational. He would appear at court events and publicly berate officials for perceived failures. He would stop officers in the street and reprimand them. He would issue decrees at all hours, often contradicting previous decrees, leaving officials uncertain about what was actually required of them. The unpredictability was worse than consistent harshness. At least consistent harshness could be navigated. Unpredictable rage could strike anyone at any moment. Foreign policy lurched equally dramatically. Paul had strong ideas about Europe's political situation and Russia's role in it. He had watched the French Revolution with horror, seeing it as the ultimate consequence of the Enlightenment ideas he associated with Catherine's court. He joined the coalition against revolutionary France, sending Russian forces to fight under the brilliant General Suvorov in Italy and Switzerland. But when Britain, Russia's ally, seized Malta, which Paul had taken under his personal protection as Grand Master of the Knights of Malta, Paul reversed course completely. Paul's decision to seek alliance with Napoleon Bonaparte seemed insane to his advisors and the Russian court. Napoleon was the embodiment of revolutionary France, the threat that Paul claimed to be fighting against. Yet Paul negotiated with Napoleon, planned joint operations against British India, and moved toward an alliance that would have fundamentally transformed European politics. His advisors couldn't predict what he would decide next because his decisions seemed driven by personal grievances rather than consistent strategic logic. The economic consequences of Paul's erratic foreign policy alarmed the merchant class and nobles who had built profitable relationships with Britain through trade. Paul's continental blockade, his restrictions on British trade, his confiscation of British ships and goods in Russian ports, all of these damaged Russian economic interests significantly. People who had been getting rich under Catherine's relatively stable policies were now watching their wealth evaporate because of an emperor's impulsive decisions. Paul's relationship with his immediate family was equally troubled. He loved his children, but ruled his court with the same rigid discipline he applied to everything else. His sons lived under constant scrutiny and occasional rage. His eldest son, Alexander, was particularly constrained, treated as both heir and potential rival. Alexander's position was agonizing. He was being trained for a throne his father occupied with increasing instability, surrounded by conspirators who assumed Alexander's eventual complicity, watching a situation deteriorate toward crisis. As Paul's reign continued, something shifted. The erratic decisions became more extreme. The suspicions became more encompassing. The punishments became less proportionate. Paul began to see conspiracy everywhere, and in this case, his paranoia was not entirely unjustified because conspiracy was indeed developing around him. Mikhailovsky Castle, which Paul had built specifically as a more defensible residence, became a symbol of his isolation. Convinced that he was unsafe in the Winter Palace, Paul had constructed an elaborate fortress palace complete with moats, drawbridges, and guard posts. He moved there in February 1801, despite the building being damp, unfinished, and genuinely unhealthy. The moats were still filling with water. Paint was barely dry on the walls. But Paul needed to feel protected, and the castle, at least theoretically, was easier to defend. The list of exiled nobles grew constantly. Paul would exile officials for small offenses, imagined insults, or simply because they had displeased him in some way he couldn't quite articulate. Some estimates suggest that Paul exiled or imprisoned more Russian nobles during his 4-year reign than Catherine had in her 34 years. Men who had served Russia competently for decades found themselves suddenly in Siberia for offenses they didn't understand. Count Peter von der Pahlen was perhaps the most dangerous appointment Paul ever made. Pahlen was the military governor of St. Petersburg, a man of considerable organizational ability, ruthless ambition, and flexible loyalty. Paul trusted Pahlen because Pahlen was skilled at appearing trustworthy. What Paul didn't know was that Pahlen was simultaneously serving as the central organizer of the conspiracy against him, coordinating a network of disaffected officers and nobles who had decided Paul had to go. Pahlen's conspiracy was an open secret in St. Petersburg's upper society by early 1801. Dozens of officers and nobles were involved or aware of the plot. The British ambassador to Russia was informed and indicated that Britain would not object to Paul's removal, given Paul's pivot toward France. This wasn't a small, secretive plot hidden in shadows. It was a broad coalition of Russia's elite organizing to murder their emperor, and Paul's information network was either too compromised or too intimidated to warn him effectively. Alexander's position in all of this was morally catastrophic. Pahlen and the conspirators had approached him, informing him of their plans and seeking at minimum his passive acceptance. Alexander was torn between horror at the idea of his father's murder and awareness that his own situation was increasingly dangerous. Paul had threatened to disinherit him, to imprison him, to send him away. Alexander extracted from Pahlen a promise that Paul would not be harmed, only forced to abdicate. He then looked away, allowing events to develop, telling himself he hadn't actually approved murder. Paul received warnings. Several people attempted to alert him that conspiracy was developing. But Paul had heard warnings before, and his response was typically either to dismiss them or to punish the messenger for alarming him. He couldn't distinguish between genuine intelligence and false accusations born of court intrigue. His paranoia made him simultaneously hypersensitive to threat and incapable of correctly identifying actual dangers. On March 11, 1801, Paul dined with his sons Alexander and Constantine, and with Pahlen and other officials. The dinner was apparently tense. Paul studied his sons' faces, searching for signs of conspiracy, looking into their eyes for evidence of betrayal. Alexander later described feeling certain his father could see through him, could detect his knowledge of the coming coup. Paul saw something in their faces, but drew no useful conclusion. That night, he went to bed in Mikhailovsky Castle for the last time. The conspirators gathered at a dinner party hosted by Pahlen on the evening of March 11th, consuming considerable quantities of alcohol before moving toward Mikhailovsky Castle around midnight. The group numbered approximately 60 officers, though only a fraction actually entered the castle. The rest waited outside, providing cover and ensuring that any soldiers who might resist were neutralized or confused about what was happening. Gaining access to the castle was easier than it should have been. Pollen's position as military governor gave him authority over the guards, and the conspirators had prepared carefully, ensuring that sympathetic officers commanded the units that night. Guards who might have resisted were replaced or confused by contradictory orders. The security apparatus that Paul had built to protect himself had been thoroughly compromised by the conspirators who controlled it. The group that entered Paul's bedroom was smaller, perhaps a dozen men, many of them drunk and emotionally agitated. What followed was chaotic rather than clinical. Paul was not asleep. He heard the conspirators forcing the door and managed to hide briefly behind a curtain or screen before being found. When discovered, he attempted to negotiate, to argue, to appeal to their loyalty. He reportedly asked what he had done to deserve this treatment. The accounts of what happened next vary in details, but agree on the essential brutality. The conspirators were drunk, frightened, and aware that if they hesitated, they were committing treason without completing it. There was no clean, dignified execution. Paul was beaten, strangled with a scarf belonging to one of the officers, and struck with a golden snuffbox. The snuffbox blow, aimed at his temple, is the detail that history remembers, the image that captures the absurd indignity of the event. Paul died sometime around midnight, strangled and beaten by men who had sworn oaths of loyalty to him. He was 46 years old. His body was arranged to look as if he had died naturally, but the marks of violence were too obvious to fully conceal. The official announcement of death by apoplexy, meaning stroke, satisfied nobody. Every educated person in St. Petersburg understood what had actually happened. The question was simply who would say so openly and who would maintain the polite fiction. Pollen went immediately to inform Alexander that his father was dead. Alexander's reaction reportedly was collapse. He broke down, unable to function, overwhelmed by grief, guilt, or some combination of both. Pollen's response was coldly practical. Enough of playing the child. Go and reign. Alexander emerged to accept the throne he had allowed to be cleared for him through his father's murder. The announcement was made to the Russian court and public. Paul I had died of apoplexy. The transition of power was smooth. No investigation was conducted into the circumstances of death. No conspirators were tried or punished. Pollen remained in power briefly before Alexander, in a gesture of limited guilt management, sent him away from St. Petersburg. But there were no prosecutions, no trials, no official acknowledgement of what had actually occurred. The conspiracy was too large to be secret, but too convenient for those in power to be prosecuted. Dozens of people had participated or known about the plot in advance. Prosecuting the conspirators would require acknowledging that Paul had been murdered, that Alexander had known about the plot and done nothing to prevent it, and that Russia's elite had collectively decided to kill their emperor. None of this could be officially admitted. Whispers circulated throughout Russian society and European courts. Foreign ambassadors reported home that Paul had clearly been murdered. British officials, who had been informed of the conspiracy in advance and had encouraged it through their silence, wrote candid dispatches acknowledging the obvious. Napoleon Bonaparte, when told that Paul had died of apoplexy, reportedly said that the English had missed his history of medicine, a sardonic reference to Britain's role in encouraging the conspiracy. The British connection was real, but indirect. Britain hadn't organized the plot, but British diplomats had made clear that Britain would not object to Paul's removal. Paul's pivot toward France had alarmed Britain, and his cooperation with Napoleon against British interests in India represented a genuine threat. The conspirators knew that removing Paul would not create foreign complications. In a period when European powers routinely interfered in each other's succession crises, this tacit approval was meaningful. Alexander spent his reign haunted by his father's death. He had allowed it to happen, convinced himself that Paul would only be forced to abdicate, and then lived with the knowledge that he had enabled murder. He never spoke about it publicly, never acknowledged his complicity, never prosecuted those responsible. But contemporaries and historians noted that Alexander's characteristic indecisiveness and spiritual searching in later life bore the marks of unresolved guilt. Paul's reputation was immediately rehabilitated in some respects after his death, which was its own commentary on his reign. People who had suffered under his erratic rule found aspects of his policies that deserved credit. His attempt to limit the exploitation of serfs was recognized as genuinely humane. His military reforms, though implemented with excessive severity, had some merit. His foreign policy, however erratic, had occasionally served Russian interests. In death, Paul became more comprehensible than he had ever been in life. The historical verdict on Paul I has been more complex than his contemporaries' dismissal of him as simply mad or incompetent. 19th century Russian historians, working in a court that had murdered him, tended to portray Paul as unstable, irrational, and dangerous. His death was treated as necessary and inevitable, the natural consequence of his unfitness to rule. Later historians found more to consider. Paul's attempts to regulate relations between nobles and serfs, limiting the number of days serfs could be required to work for their masters, represented genuine concern for the majority of Russia's population. His nobles resented these limitations precisely because they were meaningful restrictions on noble power. Paul was trying to impose obligations on a class that had grown accustomed to having none. His military reforms, brutal in implementation, had real logic behind them. The Russian army under Catherine had developed serious discipline problems. Officers had grown comfortable and complacent. Paul's insistence on proper drill and procedure, even when applied with excessive severity, addressed genuine problems. The reforms caused enormous resentment, but also produced better trained soldiers. The army that would eventually defeat Napoleon in 1812 owed something to Paul's insistence on discipline. The charges of instability and mental illness leveled against Paul have been examined skeptically by modern historians. Paul was erratic and sometimes cruel, but his behavior, while extreme, followed recognizable patterns. His hostility toward the nobility derived from genuine philosophical convictions about their excessive power. His foreign policy reversals, while dramatic, often had strategic logic. His paranoia, while excessive, was grounded in real experience. He had genuinely been marginalized and potentially threatened throughout his life. Paul's concern for proper order, hierarchy, and discipline reflected a genuine political philosophy, not simply mental illness. He believed Russia needed stronger central authority, that Catherine's indulgence of the nobility had created dangerous imbalances, and that only firm, consistent discipline could make Russia function properly. He wasn't wrong about the problems, though his solutions were often counterproductive and his implementation catastrophic. Paul I ruled for 4 years, 4 months, and 4 days. Eight's a beautiful number, isn't it? In that time, he managed to alienate virtually every powerful group in Russian society simultaneously. The nobility lost privileges and faced humiliation. The military faced exhausting reforms and arbitrary punishments. The merchant class suffered from erratic foreign policy, and the court lived in constant fear of an emperor whose moods were unpredictable. Killing him seemed to many not just permissible, but necessary for the survival of Russian society as they knew it. But understanding why Paul failed requires understanding what he was trying to do. He wasn't simply a madman lashing out randomly. He was a man with genuine convictions who had watched, for 42 years, what he considered the mismanagement of Russia. He had definite ideas about military discipline, noble obligation, proper hierarchy, and Russia's role in Europe. The problem was that 42 years of frustrated waiting had turned his legitimate insights into obsessions, and his legitimate authority into something approaching tyranny. The cruelest irony of Paul's life was timing. He received power when he was already formed, already rigid, already so saturated with resentment that he couldn't use authority wisely. A Paul who had become emperor in his 30s, who had been allowed to participate in governance during Catherine's reign, who had been treated as a partner rather than a threat, might have been a very different ruler. The Paul who finally received power in 1796 was a middle-aged man shaped by 4 decades of exclusion, humiliation, and waiting. He had been denied power for so long that he wielded it without wisdom when it finally arrived. At the same time, do not forget that the murder itself was perfectly characteristic of Russian court politics in the 18th century. Alexander I ruled for 24 years after his father's death and transformed Russia into Europe's dominant power after defeating Napoleon. His reign is remembered as Russia's greatest moment in European history. But Alexander himself was never psychologically whole after his father's murder. The guilt he carried shaped his peculiar spirituality in later life, his growing mysticism and search for religious meaning. He had begun his reign by enabling murder and spent the rest of it trying to make peace with what he had done. The question Paul's reign poses is uncomfortable. What do you do with a legitimate ruler who has genuine power but exercises it destructively? Russian society in 1801 had no constitutional answer. There was no parliament to impeach Paul, no legal process to constrain him, no formal mechanism for removing an emperor who had become dangerous. The only available answers were submission, exile, or murder. The conspirators chose murder because it was final, and because they had the power to accomplish it. The Tsar, killed by his own officers, died not because he was mad, but because he was impossible. Too rigid to bend, too impatient to build consensus, too damaged by 42 years of waiting to know how to use power wisely when it finally arrived. Russia got Alexander instead, and history moved on. Paul I remained in his cathedral, the Tsar who came too late to everything, including wisdom.